When I opened the door to that lake house and saw him standing in the hallway, barefoot, holding a half-drained mug of coffee and looking just as surprised as I felt, I froze. Not because I wasn't expecting anyone to be there, I truly believed the house would be empty, but because of how completely unprepared I was to see him. My mother's husband. My stepfather. The man I hadn't seen in nearly 2 years. The man I used to look up to in ways that were never entirely easy to explain. I stepped inside before either of us said a word. The storm behind me howled like it was warning me. But I didn't stop. Maybe because a small part of me didn't want to turn around. Maybe because something inside already knew that this weekend wasn't going to be what I had planned. I had come here to disappear for a while, to nurse the pieces of a relationship that had shattered just weeks ago. But now I was here with him, alone, surrounded by nothing but trees, water, and the silence that once made me feel safe. He offered me a towel. I took it with both hands. His fingers grazed mine. I told myself it meant nothing. That the past was too far away to be dangerous. That my mother wasn't somewhere hundreds of miles away wondering what we were doing under the same roof. And I certainly didn't tell myself the truth I'm about to tell you. Because sometimes, a person walks into a house hoping to escape, and walks out changed forever. But before I tell you the truth, I want to know something. Have you ever found yourself alone with someone you weren't supposed to miss, someone you weren't supposed to remember so clearly? Tell me in the comments, what's the one place from your past you thought was safe, until it wasn't? I arrived without calling first. I thought the lake house would be empty, it always was in the off-season. The plan was simple, disappear for a few days, ignore my phone, sleep, maybe cry a little, and leave without anyone knowing I'd been here. But when I saw him in the doorway, it was like someone had pulled the floor out from under me. He looked tired. His beard had grown in thicker since the last time I saw him, flecks of gray spreading like frost. His hair was damp, likely from stepping outside moments before I arrived. He wore a navy t-shirt and flannel pants, home clothes, not meant to be seen by anyone but yourself. And now me. I don't know who spoke first. Maybe it was him, something like, didn't expect company. Or maybe it was me, I didn't know you'd be here. In either case, we stood there for several seconds, the door wide open behind me, the rain blowing sideways through the trees. I pulled the door shut behind me and took a deep breath. The air inside the house was thick with cedar and damp cloth. A fireplace crackled faintly in the main room, and a half-finished puzzle sat on the dining table. This was his temporary escape, clearly. I had intruded. Still, he didn't seem angry. Just hesitant. I thought Mom said you were out of town, I muttered as I set my bag down by the coat rack. She did, he replied. Plans changed. We left it there. Neither of us mentioned her name again. I went upstairs to the old guest room, my room, once upon a time, and found everything just as I remembered. Same comforter. Same bookshelf with 3 of my childhood favorites. The same framed photo of the lake at sunrise. I sat on the bed and exhaled for the first time in hours. My head throbbed from the drive. My heart from everything else. The silence downstairs settled into a rhythm, the occasional clink of ceramic, the sound of him moving through the kitchen. I didn't go down right away. I changed into dry clothes, pulled my hair into a bun, and stared out the window at the churning gray sky above the lake. Eventually, I wandered down. The house wasn't large. It never had been. More of a cabin, really. Cozy, but inescapable. He handed me a mug of tea without asking if I wanted one. I accepted it without asking what kind it was. We both pretended this was normal. There were questions we weren't asking. I wasn't asking what he was doing here alone, weeks after the tourist season had ended. He wasn't asking why I had shown up out of the blue, my eyes already glassy with uncried tears. He sat on the armchair. I took the couch. Between us, a pine coffee table scarred with water rings and knife marks from long-forgotten meals. "How's work?" he asked. I gave a one-word answer. "Fine." He didn't press. He never did. That was one of the things I remembered most about him. He had a way of sitting with your pain without poking it. I was the one who finally cracked. "It ended," I said, barely above a whisper. He looked up. "The engagement?" I nodded. A pause. "Do you want to talk about it?" I shook my head. He didn't ask again. The fire had nearly died. He got up and added a few logs without a word. I watched the way his shoulders moved beneath the fabric of his shirt. Watched the way he crouched, familiar, but changed. He was older. We both were. That night, I couldn't sleep. The rain against the roof was relentless. I lay awake listening to the wind. I heard him get up around midnight, maybe for water. His footsteps padded down the hallway. I stayed still. I thought about the first time I came to this house. I was 10. My mother had just married him. He had taken the time to show me how to skip stones, how to tie a lure for fishing, how to mix the perfect hot cocoa. He was kind. Attentive. Present in ways my mother never was. That wasn't dangerous then. But it is now, isn't it? In the darkness, I felt a strange heaviness behind my ribs. A dull warmth that made me curl tighter under the covers. I closed my eyes and told myself this was temporary. I'd leave in the morning. This didn't have to mean anything. But even then, I knew. Something had already shifted. And neither of us would be able to undo it. I didn't leave the next morning. The rain hadn't stopped. If anything, it had grown heavier, drenching the trees and blurring the shoreline beyond the windows. I sat at the kitchen table in silence, wrapped in a thick wool sweater I'd pulled from the closet upstairs, one of my mother's, probably left behind from another trip. It smelled like cedar and dust, and it hung loosely on my shoulders. I didn't bother making breakfast. Just sat there with a half cup of cold tea and let my fingers trace the rings in the wood. He entered the room quietly, almost as though he didn't want to break whatever delicate balance was hanging in the air. I heard the kettle click on behind me and felt the shift of his presence as he moved around the space. We didn't speak. Not right away. But it didn't feel like avoidance. It felt like something was waiting. Eventually, he placed a fresh cup in front of me and sat across the table. He looked at me with those same eyes I remembered from when I was a teenager, calm, steady, too observant. "Roads are still bad," he said simply. His voice was low, gruff with mourning. "Might be safer to wait another day." I nodded. No resistance. Maybe because I hadn't truly wanted to leave. Maybe because I didn't know where else to go. The thought of returning to my apartment, with its half-unpacked boxes and the ghost of a life I thought I'd be living, made me feel hollow. We spent the day indoors. The electricity flickered more than once, so he pulled out a box of candles and matches and set them around the house just in case. The two of us moved through the rooms in quiet coordination, he checking windows, I folding a few stray blankets from the couch. It was domestic in a way that neither of us commented on. In the early afternoon, we sat near the fireplace. He worked on a crossword from a faded magazine while I curled up with a book I hadn't touched since college. Occasionally, one of us would ask a question, "What's a 6-letter word for betrayal?" or "Do you still drink your coffee black?" But mostly, we were just there. Breathing the same space. Sharing the same time. At one point, I looked over and saw that he had dozed off in the armchair, his chin resting lightly on his chest. The sight of him asleep stirred something quiet and unresolved in me, not longing, not desire, but a deep ache that I hadn't expected. I watched him breathe, slow and even, and wondered if he was dreaming. Wondered if my mother ever saw him this still, this unguarded. Later, the power finally went out. The house sank into a dim hush. He lit 2 candles and handed me one, and together we made our way to the kitchen. He rummaged through the drawers, pulled out a flashlight, and checked the breaker in the back hallway. I stood nearby, holding the candle like a child, unsure of what to do. "It's probably the lines," he said. "Storm's been hammering this place all night." "It's kind of peaceful, though," I replied without thinking. He looked up, met my eyes, and smiled, a small, restrained curve of the lips. "Yeah. It is." Afterward, we returned to the living room, candles flickering on the coffee table. I wrapped a blanket around myself and tucked my feet beneath me. The quiet felt deeper now. Like it had weight. He pulled out an old cassette player from the bookshelf. "This still works," he said. "At least, it did last time I tried." He popped in a tape, and soft static gave way to a low hum of music, something instrumental and melancholic, full of strings and slow piano. It filled the room gently, like water reaching the edge of a glass without spilling. We sat like that for what felt like an hour. Maybe more. Neither of us looked at the other directly, but I felt the presence of him next to me, a subtle gravity pulling at my awareness. I wondered what he was thinking. If he was regretting letting me stay. If he could feel the same strange shift I was sensing. Then he broke the silence. "Do you remember that summer when you learned to swim?" he asked, eyes on the fire. I nodded slowly. "You made me jump off the dock." I was terrified. "You did it anyway," he said. "I remember thinking how brave you were." I smiled faintly. "I think I was just stubborn." He chuckled softly, the sound low and close. "Maybe. But you didn't cry." "Not once. Even when you sank." "I knew you'd catch me." That last line came out before I could stop it, and once it did, the weight of it settled between us. He turned his head slightly. I felt the burn of his gaze, though I didn't return it. My heart thudded a little faster, and I hated that I noticed. I stood, pretending I needed to check something in the kitchen. My hands trembled slightly as I lit another candle, though I told myself it was just the cold. When I returned, he hadn't moved. "I'm going to head up soon," I said quietly. He nodded. "Good idea. It'll be warmer upstairs." But I didn't go. Not right away. I sat again, just to finish the tea, just for a few more minutes. The song on the tape shifted, something more melodic, vaguely familiar. He leaned forward, rested his elbows on his knees. "I always liked how you never forced conversation," he said. "Even as a kid, you didn't fill silence just to make it easier. I think I learned that from you." He looked over, and our eyes met. I didn't look away this time. There was something steady in his expression, something that didn't reach for me but didn't retreat either. I held it. Not in challenge, not in invitation. Just held it. We sat like that, candlelight dancing between us, music playing low, wind still howling outside the windows. And then, we kissed. No more. No less. It was quiet. It was brief. It was real. I left the room without a word. Upstairs, in the dark, I sat on the edge of the bed and tried to make sense of the storm outside, and the one beginning inside me. I woke early, though the sky was still dim and colorless. The rain had softened overnight, falling now like a whisper rather than a threat. For a long time, I stayed curled beneath the covers, trying to keep my mind still. But it wouldn't cooperate. The memory of what had happened the night before pressed against the back of my eyelids every time I closed them. I hadn't dreamt. Or maybe I had, but the dream was indistinguishable from the truth. I didn't know what time he woke up. I only heard his presence in the hallway, a door opening gently, floorboards creaking under careful steps. He didn't knock. He didn't come upstairs. But I sensed him there, moving about quietly, respectfully. That silence made everything harder. I wished, briefly, that he would say something, anything, even if it was a dismissal. But he didn't. When I finally came downstairs, he was at the table reading a paperback book, the same tea kettle hissing faintly in the background. He looked up and gave me a small nod, nothing more. And I responded in kind. That became the rhythm of the morning, stillness padded with civility, with normal gestures masquerading as peace. The radio wasn't working. The storm must have knocked out the signal. The cell reception remained patchy. I checked my phone out of habit, though I didn't expect any messages. Nothing had changed in that world since I'd last looked. No one had called. No one had texted. The silence there mirrored the one in this house. He offered to take a walk down to the dock later to check the rowboat, see if it had taken on water. I said yes before I could weigh the offer. Maybe I just wanted something to do. Maybe I didn't want to be alone with my thoughts. Or maybe it was something else, something more difficult to admit even to myself. By the time we stepped outside, the rain had reduced itself to a mist. The sky hung low and heavy, like a wet woolen sheet. The air was rich with the scent of soaked leaves, wet wood, and lake water. We didn't speak as we walked the narrow path, our boots crunching over gravel and fallen pine needles. A few birds fluttered somewhere in the distance, disoriented or maybe just waking up to the quiet after days of storm. The dock was intact, though the edges were slick and dark with moisture. He crouched to inspect the rowboat while I stood near the edge, arms crossed, watching the surface of the lake shift and ripple. "It held up better than I thought," he said after a moment. "Didn't take on much." I nodded, my gaze fixed on the horizon. "That's good." He stood and dusted his hands on his jeans, then followed my line of sight. "You used to sit here for hours," he said. "I remember. You said it made you feel small in a good way." I think I needed to feel small back then. I turned to look at him. His expression was neutral, but his eyes carried something older, something he didn't say. It wasn't the kind of silence that demanded to be filled, it was the kind that carried weight. He stepped back and leaned against the railing, arms folded. I joined him, though I kept a small distance between us. There was so much I wanted to ask. Why he never called after I moved away. Whether he had ever spoken to my mother about how things used to feel between us. Whether he thought about what happened last night. But I asked none of it. Instead, I said, "Do you think she'd be angry if she knew I came here?" He looked at me carefully. "I think she'd have questions." "About you being here?" "About a lot of things." The wind shifted slightly, curling damp air around us. I didn't flinch. I let it move through my hair, sting my cheeks, cool the space between us. When we returned to the house, I made us eggs and toast. It felt strange, doing something so domestic, but the routine grounded me. We ate at the table, facing each other, though our eyes rarely met. He complimented the eggs. I thanked him. We pretended this was ordinary. I spent most of the afternoon reading. I kept to the guest room for a while, sprawled on the bed like I used to when I was a teenager. The house was quiet beneath me, no movement, no clinking dishes, no creaking doors. Only once did I hear him pick up the phone in the hallway. The conversation was short, muffled. A few words only. When I came down later, he was outside stacking wood under the overhang. I watched from the window for a few minutes before I stepped out to join him. "You don't have to do that," I said. He looked up, shrugged. "Helps to stay busy." I reached for a log and added it to the pile. "You always said that." He paused, then smiled faintly. "You always remembered the wrong things. Or maybe just the important ones." He didn't reply to that. And I didn't press. We worked side by side for a while. Not speaking. Not needing to. And yet the silence felt heavier than it had that morning. Like we were both waiting for something, an answer, a signal, a change neither of us could name. That evening, the rain started again. I stood in the living room staring out at the lake, my fingers tracing the edges of the windowpane. I could see my own reflection faintly, half-lit and flickering in the dim glow of the fireplace behind me. He was in the kitchen, cleaning up after a simple dinner, and I could hear the soft clatter of plates and running water. I stayed there, frozen, caught between the outside world and this strange, suspended one we were building hour by hour. When he finally joined me, I didn't move. He stood a few feet behind me, not close, not far. I felt the warmth of his presence before he spoke. "It's quiet tonight." "It is." "You okay?" I wanted to say yes. I wanted to lie. But I just said, "I don't know." We didn't speak again for a while. And even though we were both fully clothed, fully aware, fully standing in a well-lit room, something about the moment felt unbearably exposed. Like nothing we were wearing could cover what we were actually feeling. I left the room first, retreating upstairs. But the feeling followed. The weight of what wasn't said. The memory of what had been. The question of what would come next. And as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I realized I was no longer sure who I was trying to protect, him, myself, or the version of me that had come here to disappear. The next morning came quietly, with a thin veil of light diffused through heavy clouds. The air smelled of damp earth and the remains of last night's fire. I lay still in bed longer than usual, my body rested but my mind still searching for direction. I didn't want to move, yet I also couldn't stand the stillness anymore. The thoughts from the night before had followed me into the daylight like a shadow I couldn't shed. Downstairs, the house was awake but subdued. He was already up, seated by the fire with a newspaper folded in his lap, though I doubted he was reading it. A mug of coffee sat untouched on the side table. He looked up as I entered, nodding as if we had merely paused our last conversation overnight and were now resuming it with silent agreement. I poured myself some coffee, took the seat across from him, and stared into the flames, letting the warmth touch my knees. We didn't speak. But the silence was no longer comforting. It felt saturated, too full, as if one more word might cause it to spill. He eventually stood, stretched his arms behind his back, and said he was going to take the old truck into town for groceries, just in case we were here longer than planned. I said I'd stay behind. I didn't want to see anyone. I didn't want to pretend to be okay in front of strangers. After he left, the house felt larger, emptier. I wandered room to room without much purpose, touching surfaces as if reacquainting myself with old ghosts. In the hallway, I paused by the bookshelf, fingers brushing the spines of books that hadn't moved in years. Some of them were mine. One still had my name inside the cover, written in blue pen with a little heart I'd drawn beside it when I was 15. In the small office tucked in the back, I found an old photo album. I hadn't seen it in a decade, maybe more. I sat on the floor and opened it, the plastic pages crackling softly in the quiet. There we were, my mother, him, and me, smiling stiffly in too many versions of the same posed lakefront photos. One with me holding a fishing pole I never wanted. One with her looking distracted. One with him standing behind both of us, his hand lightly on my shoulder. It was always the same arrangement. And then I turned a page and stopped. There was a photo I didn't remember being taken. Just him and me, sitting at the edge of the dock. I was maybe 17. He was handing me something, a cup, maybe, and we were laughing. Really laughing. My hair was wet and sticking to my cheeks, and he was shirtless, still dripping from the lake. There was no space between us. Not physically. Not emotionally. I stared at that photo for a long time. When he returned hours later, I was already back in the living room, pretending to read. He walked in with paper bags, the scent of rain and cold clinging to him. He placed the bags on the kitchen counter and began unpacking fruit, bread, a carton of eggs, a small bottle of red wine. I watched him from my seat, unwilling to help but unable to look away. We ate lunch standing at the counter. It wasn't a meal, really, just toast with peanut butter and slices of apple. No cutlery. No plates. He offered to open the wine later. I nodded but said nothing. It wasn't until dusk that the tension finally broke. I was on the back porch, staring out at the lake, wrapped in my mother's sweater again. He stepped outside, stood beside me, and leaned on the railing. The air was colder than before. The clouds hung lower. The water was still, like a sheet of pewter. I found the photo album, I said. He didn't answer right away. I wondered if you would. There's a picture in there I don't remember. We're on the dock. You're handing me something. I remember that day. Why didn't I? You were tired. We'd been out on the water for hours. Your mother didn't want to go, but you insisted. Said you needed it. I nodded, folding my arms tighter across my chest. It looked like we were happy. We were. The words hit harder than I expected. I looked at him then, really looked. His expression was calm, but his eyes carried something more, a kind of quiet resignation, or maybe just truth. I keep thinking about last night, I said. So do I. I don't know what it meant. It doesn't have to mean anything. But it does. He looked away, out toward the horizon. Maybe it just meant we're both human. I wanted to believe that. But I also knew it wasn't that simple. We stood there a long while after that, both staring into the fading light, neither of us willing to say what else was on our minds. Later that evening, we sat by the fire again. The wine was open, poured into mismatched glasses. He drank slowly. I barely touched mine. The heat from the flames reached us in uneven waves, warming one side of the body while leaving the other cool. It matched the way I felt, split, undecided, unsure. I asked him then, softly, do you ever regret staying with her? He didn't flinch. Sometimes. That's honest. It's late for lies. I sipped the wine then, more to fill the space than from any desire for taste. It was dry, with a hint of bitterness I couldn't name. He was watching the fire, not me, but I felt him listening. Do you think she ever suspected? I asked. No, he said. But I think she knew something was different between us. What kind of different? He turned to face me. The kind that people don't speak about. Even when they see it. I didn't respond. I didn't know how. That night, I lay in bed with my mind racing. I wasn't afraid. I wasn't guilty. But I was restless. There was a version of myself I had managed to keep sealed for years, and now it was waking up. Stretching. Breathing in deep. Somewhere, a line had moved. Not crossed, not shattered, just moved. Slightly. Quietly. Permanently. And now, everything felt like it had shifted around it. The morning after was colder than any we'd had so far. The fire had gone out overnight, and the windows bore a thin trace of condensation, blurring the view of the trees beyond. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, my hands wrapped around my knees, listening to the quiet house around me. I could hear faint movement downstairs, the soft clang of ceramic, a chair being pulled across the floor. It was all too normal for how I felt inside. Eventually, I made my way down. He was in the kitchen, putting 2 mugs on the table. One for him. One already filled for me. He looked over, gave a nod. No smile this time, but no coldness either. We moved around each other like people who had memorized the map of their shared space. We sat across from each other in silence, the kind that didn't need to be polite anymore. The kind that had aged overnight. I drank my coffee slowly, feeling its heat ground me, even as my mind slipped between memory and uncertainty. Neither of us brought up the previous night. It wasn't avoidance exactly. It was something else, the acknowledgement that language was too crude for what had passed between us. I found myself watching him more than I should have, observing the way his fingers moved, the way he shifted his weight, the faint lines near his eyes I hadn't noticed before. After breakfast, he asked if I wanted to go for a walk. I didn't answer at first. The idea of being outside, surrounded by trees and mist, seemed equal parts calming and dangerous. But I said yes. Maybe because I wanted him to ask again. Maybe because I was afraid of what would happen if we stayed indoors. We followed the narrow trail along the side of the lake. The ground was soft, damp with recent rain, and the sky above was an even sheet of dull white. Birds moved in the canopy overhead, their wings flashing briefly between branches. Neither of us spoke for the first 10 minutes. Then he broke the silence. "You were different last night." I didn't respond right away. I had no idea how to answer that without unraveling something. "So were you," I said eventually. We stopped near a bend in the trail where the trees thinned and gave way to a small lookout spot. The view was muted, the lake a silver expanse with faint ripples carried by wind. We stood side by side, close but not touching. "I think about time a lot these days," he said. "How fast it moves. How slowly it changes us." I watched his profile as he spoke, the sharpness of his jaw softened by the years. "I used to think I understood what you needed," he continued. "Back then. When you were younger. I thought I was just filling in space where your mother didn't." "You were," I said. "But it wasn't just that." He looked at me then. Not hard, not searching, just waiting. I forced myself to keep eye contact. "There were moments," I said, "when I felt seen in a way that no one else offered. And that scared me. It still does." The truth hovered between us. Not heavy, not dramatic. Just there, finally spoken. We continued walking in silence, each of us turning over our own pieces of that admission. Back at the house, we moved separately. I took a shower, changed clothes, and sat upstairs for a long while, staring out the window. The day moved on around me, but time felt suspended, stretching itself in all directions. In the late afternoon, I found him outside, cleaning the gutters along the side of the house. I brought him a bottle of water and leaned against the porch railing while he worked. "My mother called," I said. He paused, glancing down. "When?" "Earlier." I didn't answer. "She left a voicemail." He didn't press. Just waited. "She said she had a strange feeling," I continued. "Said she dreamed of the lake house. Asked if everything was okay." He wiped his hands on a rag and set the ladder aside. "What did you feel?" he asked. I felt like maybe she knows more than she lets on. Or maybe she just always feared something and couldn't name it. He nodded slowly. She always did have a strange intuition. We stood in the slanting light of early evening, surrounded by the quiet rustle of trees and the echo of something unspoken. I thought about calling my mother back. I thought about telling her nothing had happened, that I just needed time alone, that the storm had kept me longer than planned. But even those truths felt partial. Inside, the house felt too small again. We cooked dinner in quiet cooperation. He chopped vegetables while I stirred a pot on the stove. We moved efficiently, saying little, but the energy between us had shifted again. A return to something grounded, perhaps. Or just another attempt at control. We ate with the windows open, letting the cool air creep through. He poured wine again. I declined this time. Later, he suggested we watch something. An old movie from a dusty DVD case near the bookshelf. We sat on opposite ends of the couch. The screen flickered blue as the menu looped. I couldn't focus. My eyes were on the screen, but my thoughts were far away. I could feel the weight of everything, his presence, my silence, the tension that neither of us knew how to name anymore. I glanced at him once. He didn't look back. The movie played on. A scene involving a father and daughter. A long conversation on a porch swing. I couldn't breathe for a moment. I stood up and excused myself. In the kitchen, I stood at the sink, staring down into the empty basin, hands braced on the counter. The sound of the movie drifted from the other room, muffled and meaningless. I stayed there a long time, until the closing credits played. When I returned, he was folding up a blanket. The movie was over. He didn't ask if I was okay. And I didn't tell him. We said goodnight in soft voices, almost automatic. I went upstairs, listening to the quiet house resettle itself. Doors gently closing. Light switches flipping. Steps creaking across the floor. I sat on the bed and exhaled slowly. Outside, the wind picked up. Trees swayed. Shadows danced along the walls. And in the silence that followed, I felt something change again, not between us this time, but within me. Something had crossed over. Not loudly. Not defiantly. But definitely. And I knew it wouldn't cross back. The next day came with an eerie stillness, as if even the wind had grown uncertain. I woke earlier than usual, not from noise or light, but from something inside me pressing against my chest. It wasn't anxiety, exactly, more like an ache. The weight of something unnamed that had settled there and refused to move. I dressed slowly, layering my clothes despite the slight warmth outside. The house was quiet as ever. I padded down the stairs barefoot, hoping the cool wood under my feet would ground me. He wasn't in the living room or kitchen, but a plate with 2 slices of toast and a folded napkin sat waiting. I knew it was his doing. That quiet attentiveness he never pointed out but never forgot. I sat at the table, chewing absently, eyes fixed on the window. The sky was the color of unpolished steel, flat and pale. The lake had gone still again, only the faintest ripples hinting at the presence of life beneath. There was no sign of him. I washed my plate and moved outside. The porch creaked under my weight. I stood there a long while, scanning the edge of the trees, waiting for him to reappear. And when he finally did, emerging from the path that led toward the woods, I felt the tension in my shoulders ease slightly, though I didn't realize I'd been holding it. He approached carrying an armful of kindling, eyes downcast. When he saw me, he offered a brief nod and walked past toward the side of the house. I didn't follow right away. Something held me in place, hesitation, restraint, I couldn't tell. But eventually I stepped down into the yard, the grass damp beneath my shoes. We didn't speak for a while. He focused on stacking the wood near the wall, and I watched, hands tucked into the sleeves of my sweater. The routine movements, the small order in the midst of our disarray, it felt like the only kind of control either of us had left. I listened to the voicemail, I said quietly. He didn't look up. Just said, what did she say? She said she missed me. That she had a strange dream. That I sounded different the last time we spoke. This time he paused. Straightened up. And do you think you did? I met his eyes. I don't know. Maybe. We stood like that for several seconds, measuring each other in the distance that still remained. Then he turned, wiping his hands on his jeans, and said he was going to take the rowboat out, check on the floating dock before the weather turned. I offered to come along. The lake was colder than it had been days before. We moved in silence through the trees toward the water, the air thick with early afternoon humidity. At the dock, the boat waited, swaying gently in the water. He held it steady while I stepped in, then joined me, and we pushed off together. The motion was slow, the oars dipping rhythmically, the lake lapping against the hull in quiet pulses. I sat facing him, knees tucked close, arms wrapped around them. The wind moved across the water in a way that reminded me of old songs, soft, cyclical, just shy of melancholy. We reached the platform and he tied the boat to one of the posts. It creaked under our weight as we stepped out. He bent down, checking the chains and boards, making notes under his breath. I knelt beside him to help, even though I didn't really know what I was doing. It was enough to be near him again, in something that resembled purpose. When the checks were done, we both sat on the edge of the dock, his feet hanging just above the water. I used to come here alone, I said. Back when I was 15. I thought no one knew. I knew, he said. I turned to look at him. I used to see your footprints on the path, he continued. Sometimes I'd come down after you left. Just to see what you were seeing. A beat passed. And what did you see? You, he said. Before the world told you how you had to be. The words stayed with me, lingering like the air before a storm. I wanted to respond, but I didn't trust my voice. We rowed back without speaking, and when we docked, we moved wordlessly up the hill toward the house. The light was fading earlier than expected, clouds thickening, wind rising. The house greeted us like an old friend unsure whether to welcome us or warn us. Inside, I made tea. He added more wood to the fire. The domestic rhythm returned, but something was stirring beneath it, the sense of inevitability that had begun threading itself through our every move. I tried to fight it by doing small things, folding blankets, wiping counters, adjusting candles. But it clung to me, followed every step I took. When evening came, he asked if I wanted to watch something again. I declined. I didn't have the energy to pretend. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table while he sorted papers in the next room. My phone buzzed once, a message from my mother. Just a question, still there? I stared at the screen, not answering. I placed it face down and returned to my tea, fingers trembling just slightly. After a while, he came back and leaned against the doorway. You okay? I nodded. But my voice betrayed me. I don't know what I'm doing. He didn't answer. Just walked over and took the seat across from me. Neither do I, he said. But maybe we don't need to. We sat like that for what felt like hours, or seconds. I couldn't tell anymore. The world outside continued, indifferent to our stillness. Eventually, I reached across the table and rested my hand over his. His didn't move away. We didn't speak. We didn't explain. We kissed. Nothing more. Nothing less. And that was all it took for everything to fall into place. Or fall apart. I wasn't sure which yet. The house was quieter that night than it had ever been. Not in the way it usually settled, with the creaks and sighs of old wood expanding and contracting with the cool air. No, this quiet was deeper, heavier, as if it was trying not to draw attention to itself. Like the walls had heard too much. I didn't go upstairs after the second kiss. I didn't even rise from the chair right away. He didn't either. Our hands remained barely touching on the tabletop, as if the movement might break something we couldn't put back together. For a moment, we existed in a breathless kind of stillness, suspended between action and restraint. He stood first, slowly, like someone emerging from cold water. He looked at me, eyes unreadable, but not detached. Then he walked to the fireplace and added a few logs, the crackle of fresh flame cutting the tension without severing it. I stayed seated, unsure what was waiting for me in any room of the house, or inside myself. I eventually moved toward the stairs, my legs heavier than they should have been. I paused on the bottom step, listening. No footsteps followed. No words filled the silence behind me. I took one slow step, then another, and didn't stop until I reached my room. The door clicked softly as I closed it. I stood in the middle of the room, staring at the shadowed reflection in the windowpane. The bed looked the same, the sweater I had worn earlier folded neatly at the edge. Everything else, inside me, around me, felt altered. Rearranged. I didn't undress. I didn't even turn on the light. I sat on the bed and waited. Not for him, not for anything specific. Just waited, the way someone does when they know something irreversible is about to happen, and they don't yet know whether to resist it or receive it. Minutes passed. Maybe an hour. I lost track of time. I lay down on the bed, eyes open, the sound of the wind outside pressing against the window like a tide slowly rising. Then, soft footsteps. A brief pause outside my door. The handle turned gently. My breath caught. He entered without a word. Closed the door behind him. The space between us was quiet, and charged, and more complicated than words could carry. He stood there for a second longer than necessary, then walked across the room and sat in the chair in the corner. Not beside me. Not in the bed. Just present. I couldn't sleep, he said. His voice was calm, unhurried. I nodded. My throat was too dry to answer. I didn't come up here with any plan, he added. I just didn't want to leave you alone. That was the truest thing either of us had said in days. I sat up slowly. He didn't move. The dimness in the room made him seem softer somehow, like he belonged more to memory than to now. But this wasn't memory. This was real. Neither of us filled the silence that followed. Not with explanations, not with reassurances, not with questions we didn't want answered. Eventually, I rose and crossed the small space between us. I knelt in front of him, placing my hands on the arms of the chair. He didn't move. Didn't look away. We stayed like that, suspended in something we couldn't name, not desire, not comfort, not guilt. Something quieter. Something that had grown slowly over years, only now finding shape. When I finally stood again, I didn't return to the bed. I sat on the floor, my back against the wall, knees drawn to my chest. He remained where he was, his posture still, his breath steady. Time passed in slow, uneven waves. Nothing else happened. Nothing had to. That night, we spent the night together. The words are simple. But the weight of them, the silence inside them, carries more than I could ever say aloud. And in the hush that followed, as sleep finally reached me, I understood that the version of myself that had arrived here days ago was gone. Replaced by someone who had crossed a line so quietly she hadn't even noticed. The morning light came pale and filtered, the sky outside a muted canvas of silver and ash. I opened my eyes to the quiet hum of stillness, the kind that follows a shift so subtle it almost goes unnoticed. The air in the room felt different, not warmer or colder, but more aware, as if the space itself had been altered by presence, by decisions that couldn't be undone. I didn't move right away. The blanket was still drawn over me, my body curled slightly toward the wall. I didn't know if he was still in the room. I didn't look. For a few long moments, I allowed myself to simply exist in that fragile space between knowing and not knowing, a space that felt like balance, even if it was temporary. Eventually, I sat up. The chair was empty. A small blanket lay folded across the armrest, neatly placed. The door was slightly ajar. I could hear movement downstairs, measured, quiet. I stood slowly, my body heavy not from exhaustion, but from the weight of everything that had passed unspoken. I washed my face in cold water and pulled my hair back. I dressed without looking in the mirror. I didn't want to see myself yet. Not this new version. Not the reflection of someone who had crossed something, not a rule, but a rhythm, and now had to live inside the echo of it. Downstairs, he was at the stove, stirring something gently in a small pot. The smell of oatmeal and cinnamon wafted faintly in the air. He didn't turn when he heard me. I didn't announce myself. But as I sat at the table, he placed a bowl in front of me and said softly, "Eat while it's warm." I ate slowly, quietly, spoon after spoon of something that tasted too simple for how complicated I felt. He sat across from me, his own bowl barely touched. We didn't speak for several minutes. The air between us held everything, the silence of the previous night, the history of years, the dull buzz of what came next. Finally, he said, "You don't have to explain anything." I didn't lift my eyes. I wasn't going to. "Good," he said. We finished the meal without another word. When the dishes were rinsed and drying on the rack, I stepped out onto the porch. The air smelled of moss and wet bark. The trees stood still, heavy with mist. The lake looked farther away than it usually did, like it was shrinking back into the landscape. I stood there for a long time, arms folded against the chill. At one point, I heard him step outside too, though he didn't come near. I felt his presence behind me, like a shadow too polite to cast itself over mine. Eventually, I turned. "I think I'm leaving today," I said. He nodded. "That's okay. I need to go back. Figure out what this means." Again, he nodded. "You don't owe me an answer." "I know. But I owe one to myself." That was the truth I could hold on to. The one thread that hadn't frayed. We went about the rest of the morning in near silence. He didn't ask if I needed help packing. I didn't ask if he wanted to walk me to the car. We moved around each other with quiet intention, as if both trying to preserve something delicate without naming it. I folded the sweater I had borrowed and left it neatly on the bed. I zipped up my bag and paused for a second too long before lifting it. When I brought my things down, he was sitting in the armchair again, staring out the window. He stood when I entered, not to approach, but out of respect. He didn't ask if I was sure. He didn't try to stop me. For that, I was grateful. At the door, I turned back. "Thank you for letting me stay. You always had a place here," he said. Even when I didn't know it. That stayed with me. It still does. I drove slowly down the narrow road, the trees folding in above like an archway, shielding me from the sky. My phone buzzed twice in the passenger seat, but I didn't look. The road curved gently around the lake, and as I passed the last clearing, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The house had already disappeared behind the trees. The city felt louder than I remembered. My apartment smelled like dust and unopened windows. I dropped my bag at the door and didn't bother unpacking. I went to the bathroom, washed my hands twice, then sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the floor. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the occasional car outside, the hollow silence of a space I had once called home. I replayed the last week in fragments, not scenes, but sensations. The sound of rain. The creak of the stairs. The warmth of a second glance. The taste of unsaid things. In the morning, I opened my phone. 3 missed calls from my mother. 1 voicemail. I didn't play it. I wasn't ready to hear her voice. I wasn't ready to hear what she might have sensed in mine. I opened a blank note and typed 4 words. I crossed something quiet. Then I closed the phone again. I didn't know what I was building toward. But I knew it wasn't denial. And whatever shape it would take, it had already begun. I didn't unpack for 3 days. The bag stayed by the door, untouched, like a tether to everything I had left behind. I moved around my apartment in slow, deliberate motions, trying not to let anything settle. I made tea. I left it half-finished. I tried to read. I stared through the words. I went out for a walk and returned within minutes, the city too loud, too fast, too indifferent. The silence of the lake house echoed in me, and nothing here could replace it. My mother called again. Twice. I let both go to voicemail. The 3rd time, I answered without meaning to, the phone already at my ear before I knew what I was doing. Hello? Her voice was clipped, uncertain. Hi, I said, my throat dry. You're back, she said, and it wasn't a question. I am. There was a pause. I imagined her in the kitchen, pacing slowly, one hand pressed to her forehead the way she always did when thinking. You sound different. I'm tired. Tired, she repeated, her tone unreadable. How long were you there? Just a few days. And how was he? The question landed like a stone in shallow water, no splash, just a dull impact that echoed. He was fine. Another pause. Did anything happen? My stomach tensed, not at the question itself, but at how she asked it. She didn't mean weather or car trouble. She meant something else entirely. Something she wasn't sure she had the right to say aloud. No, I said, and hated how quickly the word came. She didn't speak again for several seconds. I had a dream, she said finally. While you were there. I couldn't see clearly. Just the 2 of you. It didn't feel right. I don't want to talk about dreams. Neither do I, she said, and the silence after that was heavier than anything either of us could have added. Will you come for dinner next week? I don't know. She sighed. You've been away too long. From all of us. I didn't answer. We both knew the call was over. After she hung up, I stood by the window and watched the street. People walked by, arms full of groceries, dogs pulling on leashes, voices raised in casual chatter. Everyone seemed to have a direction. I felt like I had none. That night, I took the photo from the drawer beside my bed. The one I'd kept since college, of me, him, and her on the deck of the lake house, smiling toward the camera. I studied the faces. My mother's expression, faintly distracted. Mine, bright and youthful. His hook quiet, watchful, always slightly turned toward me. I slid the photo back into the drawer. The next day, I found myself walking aimlessly, turning corners without plan. I passed familiar buildings and shops that no longer felt familiar. I stopped at a park bench, sat, and watched the world drift by. An older woman walked by slowly, arm looped through her husband's. They didn't speak, but the ease between them made my chest tighten. In that moment, I realized I didn't miss him. Not in the way people usually meant. I missed the version of myself I had become in that house, the version that was honest without apology, still and sharp, quiet but sure. I missed the stillness, the truth of it. The terrible, beautiful intimacy of being fully seen without being reduced. That evening, I wrote him a letter. Not long. Not elaborate. Just a few lines. Asterisk, I don't regret it. But I don't know what to do with it. Thank you for seeing me, asterisk. I folded the paper and placed it in an envelope. I didn't have his address, not a proper one, not for where he stayed now. So I kept it on the table by my keys, unsure if I ever meant to send it. Days passed. I returned to work. Answered emails. Sat through meetings. Laughed at the appropriate times. But beneath it all, a new quiet had taken root. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. I didn't even tell myself, not out loud. One night, I walked by a bookstore window and saw a collection of essays on solitude. I bought it without reading the description. At home, I opened to a random page and found a line underlined in red ink, asterisk, some silences are meant to be kept, not broken. They are not secrets. They are sanctuaries, asterisk. I reread that line several times. It stayed with me long after I closed the book. Eventually, I returned to the drawer and took out the photograph again. This time, I didn't study the faces. I looked at the distance between us, not measured in inches, but in years, in choices, in the version of love that hides inside silence. And then, without ceremony, I folded the photo in half and placed it inside the envelope with the letter. Not to erase it, but to keep it whole. To let it belong to itself. To let it stay quiet, the way it was always meant to be. The day I saw him again, it wasn't planned. I hadn't expected to be in that part of the city. I hadn't expected anything, really, not the breeze that carried the smell of early autumn, not the way the sky tilted softly toward gray, not the sudden stillness that wrapped itself around me the moment our eyes met. He was walking out of a hardware store, paper bag tucked under one arm, jacket unzipped like he hadn't realized the weather had changed. I stopped mid-step, unsure whether to move forward or backward, unsure whether he would. He did. With the same quiet steps I remembered from the lake house. The same steady eyes. The same pause between his breath and his words. We stood just a few feet apart, surrounded by strangers moving with urgency, their conversations folding and unfolding around us like pages in a book neither of us were reading anymore. "Hi," I said. "Hi," he answered, like it had only been days, not weeks. We didn't embrace. Didn't shake hands. There was no performance. Just two people carrying a silence no one else could hear. I asked if he had time for coffee. He nodded. We found a quiet place nearby, not too busy, not too empty. We sat by the window, not facing the street, but angled slightly toward each other, as if neither of us wanted to lose sight but neither wanted to press in too close. I asked how he'd been. He said fine. I didn't press. He asked how the city felt. I said loud. We both smiled, but the smiles didn't last. They weren't meant to. The conversation drifted from weather to work to familiar, safe corners of life that wouldn't threaten the still line between us. And yet, even in those safe topics, the undercurrent remained, a quiet awareness that something between us had existed and passed and still hadn't gone. At one point, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He hesitated, then slid it across the table toward me. It was the letter. My letter. I found a return address on the back of the envelope, he said. Didn't know if I should write back. I unfolded it slowly. It hadn't changed. Same words. Same creases. I didn't send it to be answered, I said. I figured. We sat in silence after that. Not uncomfortable. Just full. I placed the letter back in my bag, carefully, like a keepsake I didn't know I was ready to carry again. He watched me, his gaze softer than I remembered, or maybe just clearer. "I still think about that last night," he said. "Not because of what happened, but because of what didn't." I looked at him. "I know. I wasn't sure how to name any of it. I'm still not. Maybe it doesn't need a name." He nodded slowly. "Maybe it just needed time." Outside, people passed by the window. A child pressed his face against the glass for a moment, then ran back to his mother. A bus rolled through the intersection, its wheels kicking up yesterday's dust. When the coffee was gone, we didn't order more. He asked if I was walking home. I said yes. He offered to walk me part of the way. I said okay. We didn't touch. We didn't brush shoulders. But something about walking side by side again, in a new place, without the weight of the lake house pressing down, felt like closure, even if neither of us used that word. At the corner, where his path diverged from mine, we stopped. "I'm glad you wrote the letter," he said. "I'm glad you read it." We didn't say goodbye. We just let the moment end the way it needed to, quiet, unfinished, full of everything we had already said without speaking. I walked the rest of the way alone. When I got home, I placed the letter back in the drawer, alongside the photo. I didn't unfold either. I didn't need to. They weren't memories anymore. They were chapters. Closed. Not erased. Not undone. Just placed where they belonged. And so was I.